There was a time during World War II when the fate of thousands depended not on firepower, but an illusion. An army that didn't truly exist, made of inflatable tanks, fake radio chatter, and sound effects that moved through Europe, tricking Nazis at every turn. This was the Ghost Army, a top-secret unit of artists, actors, sound engineers, and designers whose battlefield wasn't just the front lines, but the imagination of the enemy. Their mission was simple: deceive, distract, and mislead. But behind smoke and mirrors were real dangers, missions so risky that a single slip-up could ruin everything. They faked entire divisions, staged phantom invasions, and helped secure crucial victories, including one of the most important battles of World War II. Yet for decades, their story was buried in secrecy, locked away by the US government, because what they did wasn't just bold, it was revolutionary. It was the war turned theater. So let me take you back to 1944, where a different kind of soldier stepped onto the battlefield, not with bullets, but with brushes, speakers, and lies that saved thousands, maybe millions of lives. In 1943, Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Ingersoll would participate in helping the British mislead the Germans as to where the D-Day landings would take place, and after being a part of the British deception efforts, he would suggest to the US about creating a phantom unit, a unit that would be used to fool and mislead the enemies during war. And on December 24, 1943, a letter would be sent from London to Washington requesting the creation of the Ghost Army, where it was then ordered by Dwight Eisenhower to be assembled at top priority. It was believed that even with all the manpower and weaponry available, the deception would be a key factor in deciding the war's victor. But this wasn't as simple as it sounded. For this wild card to work, the Ghost Army comprised of three kinds of deception: visual deception using dummies to confuse ground and air units, audible deception to paint mental pictures of possible danger that was invisible, and radio deception so that when the enemy intercepted comms, they would intercept false information. They would start their search by looking for members for the visual deception group and selected 350 men for the camouflage battalion that had a heavy amount of artists, quoted by Winston Churchill, "In wartime, truth is so precious that she always be attended by a bodyguard of lies." Before the war even started, the army was already looking for artists because of how much they emphasized using artistry to create camouflage. But when it came to recruiting artists, things were done differently. You see, if you were an artist in the visual deception group, it was something you had to apply and be accepted for, unlike the main front where you were drafted and then forced to be in the front lines. By 1942, they were camouflaging all sorts of projects and utilities. They even had the task of making a B-26 manufacturing plant look like the hillside from the air. But in 1944, the camouflage artists would be selected to join the 23rd Squadron, codenamed the Ghost Army, where instead of hiding, they would instead draw attention to themselves. They would be tasked to create and use decoys and artillery to create fake armies. At the time, the concept was so crazy that they had to make it up as they went, experimenting by making fake tanks out of metal frames and cloth, which was then put on a Jeep to sell the full look, but the frames were too heavy and broke easily. But then they created their final product, balloon tanks made out of rubber. They were easy to pack up, set up, and carry, which was perfect for missions when you need to be able to set up in a short notice and be able to retreat whenever signaled. However, there are still two more versions of deception needed to make this all work: audible and radio deception. For audible deception, the enemy thought of using sounds to fool the enemy, using technology that had only been created a few years prior, all under the command of Hilton Howell Rayleigh, the father of the Sonic Project. In early 1944, Rayleigh would send a team with a portable audio studio down to Fort Knox, Kentucky, where they would record all sorts of army sounds like tanks moving, commanders yelling, and building construction for over 3 weeks. And when they were ready to test these recordings, they would play the sounds on a 500-pound speaker with an audio range of nearly 15 miles. To put into perspective, if you put 15 football fields end to end, they would only have a distance of 1 mile. Now imagine 225 of them. That's how far away you could be while still being able to hear the speakers. But there was still one form of deception that put everything together: the deception of radio. By some estimations, it was believed that German army units intercepted up to 70% of their intel from intercepting radio comms. During the war, the British had captured a German radio interception unit where they saw that the Germans were able to pinpoint Allied units and were even shocked at how good they were at doing it. To convincingly fool the enemy, more than 100 skilled radio operators were taken for squadrons all over the country, most not knowing why or where they would be taken. Coming from one of the army lieutenants taken, I had no idea why I was there or what I was to be doing. After I was there for a few days, I spoke to this major and I said, "What is this organization?" And he said, "Let's put it this way, Lieutenant. If we are totally successful, you may not come back." They would later find out that their new mission was to copy and mimic the units that they'd be impersonating. In theory, it sounded simple, but if the enemy were able to figure out that the radio diversion was fake, it would have most likely spelt the end for the 23rd Division. With all three divisions established, they would head to Europe in May of 1944. Many of the soldiers uncertain but not afraid, one of them stating, "None of us took it that seriously. We did what we were supposed to do. We didn't really believe the big picture until we got fired upon and shot at when reality struck." It was around 8 days before D-Day when sudden orders had come down for a 15-man brigade to head down to Normandy with their inflatable army. But that group was only a fraction of the total Ghost Army, the first test to see if they could really fool the enemy and make it out to tell the tale. This 15-man squadron was under the command of Lieutenant Bernie Mason, and the objective of the group was to set up fake artillery 1 mile in front of the real army, hoping to draw gunfire onto their position. This would go on for nearly 28 days, and the diversion was successful. Yet what was even more miraculous was that the group suffered not one casualty, but of all the missions that they had, there was one that could have killed nearly 1/3 of their total troops. On March 12, 1945, they had undergone a mission where they were impersonating the 80th Infantry Division, and unfortunately for them, their diversion worked a little too well. There were people probably no more than 20-30 feet away from me that lost limbs because of the shrapnel falling all over. With the direness and seriousness of the situation, they would finally receive the signal that ordered them to retreat, but for the first time during their existence, death had caught up to the Ghost Army with 2 dead and about 15 wounded. But just 2 weeks later, the Ghost Army would set out for their last and most crucial mission of World War II. There was a river that served as a natural barrier for one of the most important parts of Germany, the Rhine River, but the main question was how they would get across that 1,300-foot body of water without losing the bulk of their troops. This is where the 23rd came in. Their job was to fool the Germans into believing the troops would be attacking from the same spot just 10 miles south. To pull the last mission off, they would use every troop and soldier they had available, which hadn't been done once during this entire war. Because in order for Operation Wehrhahn to be successful, they would need to convince the Germans that their 1,100 troops were 30,000. On March 24, the Navy began crossing the river, most men subconsciously doubting the Ghost Army's efforts, mentally prepared to face the incoming fire. But what they found was loosely organized resistance, as if the Germans weren't expecting an attack over there at all. The 9th U.S. Army gets across with so few casualties that they would almost get that many casualties if they were running a big training exercise. Many of the soldiers believed that the decoys were successful, but it would be confirmed when they found captured German maps showing that they thought the U.S. Army was right where the Ghost Army was. But because of how secret this tactic was to the rest of the world, what would happen to the men after the world was over? With many of the soldiers doing art before enlisting, they would stick with it even after enduring the trauma of World War II, with Private Ned Harris stating, "I learned more about who I was as an artist and learning my craft by being there rather than even at school." And many of the men would go on to achieve success, like being able to design exhibits for the US government. Some became fashion superstars or had world-renowned illustrations, but none of them were able to express or talk about the experience that they got from being in the Ghost Army. And with how effective it was against Germany, they didn't want to release this information while they're in a conflict with Russia during the Cold War, keeping this information classified for over 4 decades.